Professor Hannah Holzschneider was born in Krefeld in the Lower Rhineland, Germany. She holds an MPhil from Trinity College Dublin, a postgraduate diploma in Jewish Studies from the University of Oxford, and a PhD from the University of Birmingham. She came to Edinburgh in 2005, first as lecturer, and then became senior lecturer in Jewish Studies in 2011. She has been visiting in appointments at various universities around the world, including the Catholic University of Leuven, St. Edmund's College University of Cambridge, and the Technical University of Berlin. She was appointed to the chair of Contemporary Jewish Cultural History in August 2023. Professor Holzschneider is an historian of 20th century Jewish history, with a particular focus on the consequences of the Holocaust. She held an AHRC award for her project Jewish Lives, Scottish Spaces from 2015 to 2018, and she was the British Association of Holocaust Studies founding member and president in 2014. She was the British Association for Jewish Studies president in 2017 and hosted a hugely successful conference on the theme of migration, which brought around 100 international Jewish studies scholars to Edinburgh. She is co-editor since 2010 of Holocaust Studies, a journal of culture and history. Her publications include, amongst many other articles, her key monographs: German Protestants Remember the Holocaust, Theology and the Construction of Collective Memory in 2001, The Holocaust and Representation of Jews, History and Identity in the Museum in 2011, and Jewish Orthodoxy in Scotland, Rabbi Salis Daish's and Religious Leadership, Scottish Religious Cultures, Historical Perspectives from Edinburgh University Press in 2019. She has also co-authored a monograph with Peter Davis, Sheila Yellen, and Christoph Thonfeld on Olga Langyal's Auschwitz-Survivor Interdisciplinary Explorations, which is coming out this April 2025. And she has co-edited with Mia Spiro and Phil Alexander a work called Narrative Spaces at the Margins of British Jewish Cultures, a special issue of Shofar, an interdisciplinary journal of Jewish studies. It is impossible to capture the rich and wide-ranging insights from all these works from Professor Holzschneider and her prestigious academic career. But I wish to highlight, as a non-specialist, some key aspects of those works and to gather some threads of appreciation. For what is extraordinary in these studies is the scope and wide-ranging domains of analysis for contemporary Jewish cultural history. It is the capacity of Professor Holzschneider to open a series of original interdisciplinary engagements which deal with different representations of Jewish cultural history across what she calls in her later work, and I quote, a complex web of cultures in transition, and which, as she states in that same work, something that situates Jewish religious life in specific historical moments. This requires multiple layers of thinking and analysis. It requires a deep understanding of the domains of that analysis, the source material to form that analysis, and sharp critical questions to illuminate it. She brings all of this together in her main works, which explore the different representations of Judaism across intellectual theology, museums, migration studies, and local historical and located communities, which demands an incredible grasp of those specific domains in order to understand the representations of Jewish culture. Such that we see in her first work how the cultural history of Jewish and non-Jewish relations are shaped by German Protestant theologians. And in her second work, we see in the complexities of history and the identity of museums the presentation of Holocaust history and the specificity of how this is represented in the Imperial War Museum in London and the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And here she brings deep insights from museum studies and new museology, including Foucault's own critical thinking in relation to that domain, which sheds light on the narratives of Jewish history and the Holocaust. And in her third work, she extends these domains of analysis to consider the provincial Jewish leaders in Britain within a transnational framework, studying Jewish migration across the Anglophone world, showing that a local history focus can draw out patterns of wider religious developments in an age of migration in the late 19th and 20th century. Understanding Jewish cultural history is understanding these historical domains in great detail, which emerges from bringing together and reading an equally wide range of sources. In these studies, we see the use of documents and archives that show, as Professor Holzschneider indicates in her preface to her third book, The Historian Cum Detective, an unearthing of the historical dimensions, and a skillful analysis of the wider contexts and the transmission of memory. Her work examines oral histories, personal archives, photographic materials, letters, and brings all of these together into a sharp analysis of the material with, as she says, some challenging questions. First, the German-Jewish conflict of memory of the Holocaust, or the critical exercise of semiotics in the analysis of exhibition representations of minority-majority and majority-minority in museums. And, as she states, the task of articulating and re-articulating aspects of the national narrative in museums and exhibitions in terms of belonging and exclusion. Professor Holzschneider's work does not avoid what she calls the consideration of complexity. And indeed, the success of her work is to focus on that very complexity. And we are in her debt for the way that she transforms our thinking and understanding of Jewish culture and history through the complexities, which keeps us in focus to the issue of rethinking all of these issues across those specific domains. And as her talk this evening indicates, it is about a focus and a listening and a revealing. As she powerfully stated in her first work, reflecting on German Protestant theologians, and thinking about the inside and the outside of community, where she states, if memory can be acquired through knowledge and empathy, then experiences we do not share can still become part of our memory and thus be owned by people who lack first-hand experience or who do not share in the history of a community in the first place. It is this insight that shows Professor Holzschneider's intellectual leadership in Jewish cultural history, which speaks both inside that cultural history and beyond, and demonstrates to us all why it is fundamentally important in understanding ourselves, our history, our location and place. Professor Holzschneider's inaugural lecture tonight is entitled Eavesdropping on Other People's Conversations, German-Jewish Refugee Family Correspondence in Holocaust Historiography. Would you please all welcome to the platform for her inaugural lecture, Professor Hannah Holzschneider, Chair of Contemporary Jewish Cultural History.
Thank you, Jeremy, for this very generous introduction. And thank you all for taking the time to be here this evening, in person and online, and to enjoy this moment with me. Before I turn to the lecture topic, I would like to express my gratitude to all who made this event possible: the New College events team, expertly guided by Cathy Frossard, and Pippa Innes, who shouldered the organisation, and Rory Dunlop, who's making sure that folks online can see and hear. Thank you to the staff at Old College for hosting us tonight, and to the university's catering service and staff for providing us with refreshments later on. Nobody reaches a professorial chair all by themselves, and so it is my privilege to thank the many people who've accompanied me on my professional path and who have enabled my career. I can say that I am an accidental academic. By that I mean that I did not set out to become an academic, but rather that during my time at university, opportunities presented themselves that I was privileged to take up and grow with. All my degrees in Ireland and the UK were only possible because of the generous awards that funded fees and maintenance, and thus let me develop my evolving scholarly interests. In contrast to many students today, I didn't need to choose between living and studying. So thank you to the various foundations that enabled me to flourish. I hope that such funding will continue even as the university sector undergoes enormous changes. Mentorship, when I grew up as a scholar, was not something enshrined in degree programs, as it is, thankfully, today. And so here is a shout out to the scholars who at crucial stages in my education invested time, thought and kindness in helping me to navigate the next stages of my career. Female mentors and peers in particular provided role models for what it may look like to be a woman and a mother in academia, and what kind of a scholar I wanted to become. Without Peter Heyman, my subject and my job would not exist in the School of Divinity. It is thanks to Peter's expansive intellectual interest in the relationship between Jewish history and culture that shaped his research and his teaching, that a position in contemporary Jewish studies was created at New College. Every one of my successes, however, is built on the foundations of a strong partnership. So thanks go to my partner for creating our family with me and for endlessly and generously supporting what I do. And thank you to our daughters for sharing me with a job that I love and for being here tonight. This is also an evening of firsts. In my family, I was the first to attend higher education beyond a professional qualification, the first to migrate abroad, and the first to work in a university. At the School of Divinity, indeed in the University of Edinburgh, I am honored to be the first professor in Jewish history. The study of Hebrew, however, has a long history in the School of Divinity. Indeed, the currently vacant chair of Hebrew and Oriental languages dates back to 1642 and was the second chair awarded to the university, the first being the chair of divinity, founded in 1620, currently held for the first time by a woman, my colleague, Professor Rachel Muirs. The first incumbent of the chair of Hebrew and Oriental languages was indeed a Jew, the illustrious Julius Conradus Otto from Vienna. A convert to Christianity, born Naphtali Margoliot, Otto later returned to his Jewish origins. He occupied the chair for a little more than a decade. A further Jewish incumbent in the same century was Alexander Amadeus from Florence, who stayed in post a mere 2 years from 1679 to 1681, and about whom little else is known. The study of Hebrew flourished particularly so in the second half of the 18th century when James Robertson, pictured here on the right, held the chair from 1751 to 1792 and established Hebrew in the training of ministers. Today, the study of Hebrew and the ancient Jewish world remains a fixture in the School of Divinity, even if, sadly, it is no longer a compulsory part of the training of ministers. The study of Jewish history, religion, and cultures beyond the ancient world is a relatively new addition to the School of Divinity, dating from the 1980s, and is strongly associated with Frank Whaling's design of an MA in Religious Studies. With the transformation of the School of Divinity into a center for the study of religion and theology, which embraces the study of traditions other than Christianity, a chair in contemporary Jewish cultural history became a possibility. In addition, stronger links with colleagues across the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences are now offering opportunities to integrate the study of Jewish cultures into a range of degree programs. And recent generous donations to a PhD scholarship and for scholarly and public-facing activities in Jewish studies, success in obtaining AHRC funding for PhD students in Jewish studies, and a range of networking activities are positively changing how Jewish studies at Edinburgh is perceived across the UK and internationally. Now to the topic. In an interview in The Guardian in November 2024, writer Maggie O'Farrell describes what is important to her. It is always the gaps in stories that interest me, the missing elements. I am drawn not to the main characters in history, but the people who inhabit the shadows, the ones you can catch only a glimpse of from the corner of your eye. The gaps are not only fascinating to novelists, but increasingly historians are working to understand populations that never occupied the main stage, but whose lives were impacted by major historical events, who created meaning in challenging circumstances that shaped and reshaped their consciousness. Oral historian Alessandro Portelli memorably drew attention to the kind of labor involved in researching such populations. His work and mine concerns the space in between, that is, the exploration of what happens between events and their tellings, particularly in the lives of so-called ordinary people. In this lecture, I would like to share some of my current research in the gaps, or in the space between, in which I write about the people you can catch only a glimpse of from the corner of your eye. As many of you may already know, I have been working for a while now with a large collection of letters of one Jewish family who were displaced from their homes by the Nazis' racial policies. The family archive was largely compiled by one member of the family, Ernst Oppenheim, and after his death it was expanded by his niece, Dorit Sim. In 1939, Dorit Oppenheim, then 7.5 years old, became a child refugee from Nazi Germany when a Kindertransport brought her from her home in Kassel in Germany to Edinburgh, where she grew up. Her children brought this collection of documents and artifacts to be cared for at the Scottish Jewish Archive Centre in Glasgow, where it is now accessible to researchers and has become the focus of local and international Holocaust education projects. I am grateful to the Sim family and to the Scottish Jewish Archive Centre for providing access to this remarkable collection. My interest in this collection has, in the first instance, focused on the letters that crossed the Atlantic from 1936 until 1950, when correspondents worked hard to maintain a sense of family while they were negotiating flight from Nazi persecution and sought to escape murder and attempted rescue. For scholars today, letters, such as those of the Oppenheims, become a mirror of the complexity of flight and of settlement in different places, as each writer emerges on the page with their own specific concerns, connected to each other by family ties that keep changing and adapting to the permanent long-distance separation of the family unit. As we will see, the family now exists only on paper and transnationally in the space of the letters that evoke, manifest, and reframe the family. As Rita A. Rannan has shown, letters construct narratives and thereby become sites for the exploration of selves in communication with others, sites that translate immediate experiences into culturally recognizable forms of reflected experience. Eavesdropping on the Oppenheim family's conversations makes readers witnesses to the social worlds of refugees in different places of settlement and can offer access to the meanings of family in transnational contexts of displacement. This process of listening in to unfolding conversations occurs, of course, not in secret. But eavesdropping as a metaphor points to the complex nature of this listening in from a distance. Understanding this complexity demands a good deal of contextual, methodological, and also imaginative framing. I am suggesting that close analysis of refugee correspondence allows us to attune ourselves to the complexities of the lived reality of refugees from Nazi Germany and of those unable to flee. Attuning ourselves means making visible letters as sites of communication and making visible the emotional freight the letters carried and often still continue to carry today. I propose that scholars today, as unintended readers of such private correspondence, need not only to understand letters as sources of information, but rather to approach them as aspects of a multifaceted set of historical documents that enable access to the experience and life worlds of being a refugee. Letters as access points to historical experiences mean that letters open up opportunities for inquiry and reflection, rather than being treated as bodies of information whose meaning is singular and easy to interpret. It takes some effort to grasp the experience of marginalized figures, their perspective on historic events, and the importance of their relationships to each other, which are communicated on a familiar basis. This is part of a cultural history of the Holocaust, which requires us to set aside the discourses about the Holocaust established by historians focused on the magnitude of the killing or on the scale at which the state was employed, and which prefer to use Jewish voices as subjective illustrations of a broader narrative, thereby prone to overlooking the cultural context of victim-produced historical sources. Rather, as Amos Goldberg already proposed in 2012, a cultural history of the Holocaust focuses on, and I quote, the mechanisms through which victims produced meaning and the nature of the consciousness they developed within the difficult circumstances into which they were thrown. To do so, a cultural history of the Holocaust analyzes central aspects of Jewish daily experience as expressed in writing from the period, experiences of despair, of shame, truncation, fundamental upheaval of the self, tremendous anxiety about the future, mourning and terror, radical disorientation, helplessness, unraveling of everyday habits, and more. Such work permits much later readers to reconstruct and thereby witness the life worlds of historical actors, in our case, the members of the Oppenheim family, as they negotiated the challenges of flight from Nazi Germany. In the following, we will look at family, at letters, and at meaning production as three categories of inquiry that permit us to visualize being a refugee and to cast light on the scholarly process of witnessing the historical life worlds of the correspondents. In 1933, 3 generations of the Oppenheim family were living in Kassel, Frankfurt am Main, and Ludwigsburg. 7 years later, the Oppenheims were dispersed through emigration and flight from the German Reich to Toronto, Edinburgh, and New York, while others who remained in Kassel were deported and were murdered. The Oppenheims had worked their way up from artisans in the 18th and 19th centuries to the aspirational upper middle class. In his lifetime, upwardly mobile Julius Oppenheim made the journey from countryside to city, was the first in his family to enter university, qualified as a GP, and married Amalia Meyer, the daughter of a well-to-do textile merchant. He went on to establish a successful professional career and a comfortable life for himself and his family. His 3 children all went into white-collar employment with Jewish businesses. The family was embedded in local Jewish society, though their social life is difficult to reconstruct. World War I saw Julius serve as a medic and his eldest son Hans enlist with the dragoons, returning from active service with medals. Hans then found employment in Kassel's metal factory, Metallwerke Liebig, where he worked in a range of managerial positions until the company was Aryanized in 1939. He married his childhood sweetheart Gertrud in 1930, and their only child Dorit was born in December 1939. Younger sister, middle child Alice, had flown the nest and worked as secretary and manager in the shoe factory of the Adler brothers in Frankfurt am Main, her weekends often taking her back to Kassel to visit family. Youngest son Ernst struck out on his own to work in Ludwigsburg and other parts of Europe for import-export companies before extending a business trip to Canada in 1936 and eventually settling in Toronto, where he founded a wood import business. Alice and Ernst remained single. While Ernst appears to have pushed for his parents and siblings to consider leaving Germany right after his own decision to remain in Canada, the remaining family in Kassel and Frankfurt seems to have seriously considered fleeing Germany only after the events of the state terror of 9th and 10th of November 1938, commonly known as Kristallnacht. Then, Ernst was able to persuade his parents to leave, and he managed to obtain permission for them to immigrate to Canada on the condition that he would not seek to bring any other relatives into the country. Losing all their modest assets, Alma and Julius arrived in Toronto in March 1939. Hans and Trudy found a place for their daughter Dorrit on a Kindertransport in July 1939, while seeking employment in Britain themselves. Hans, having lost his job at Metallwerke Liebig, began to work for the Jewish Council of Germany in April 1939 and became the head of its administration in Kassel at the beginning of 1941. Hans and Trudy were forced to move into ever smaller apartments and rooms as Jewish life in Germany was severely limited in the lead-up to the deportation of the remaining Jewish population from September 1941. Their efforts to secure visas to the UK or the US were unsuccessful, and they had neither assets nor connections that would have enabled them to seek refuge elsewhere. Hans and Trudy were eventually deported in spring 1943 to Theresienstadt Ghetto on the last transports to leave Kassel. In all likelihood, Hans and Trudy would have been fully aware what awaited them, because Hans's job with the Jewish Council had tasked him with the dissolution of Jewish communities in the disposal of their assets and with the arrangement of deportations. Indeed, the majority of Kassel's Jews had been deported in 1941 to Riga, where they became victims of the mass shootings characterizing the Holocaust before and alongside the death camps which industrialized the murder process. In October 1944, Hans and Trudy were on transports to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where they were murdered, likely immediately upon arrival. Alice, a middle-aged single woman, followed her employer, Ludwig Adler, to New York, finding temporary refuge on the way with a foster family who was looking after her niece, Dorrit, in Edinburgh. When her visa arrived in early 1940, Alice settled permanently in New York and worked until her retirement for the Flag and Eagle Tanning Company established by Ludwig Adler. The first community humans are born into is a family, linked by ties of kinship, whether biological or social. Families take many forms across time and different cultures, so that the shorthand term family does not imply a specific nuclear heteronormative setup. Family ties, or their absence, are constitutive of a person's experience of belonging. Unsurprisingly, research on the family is proliferating in disciplines that address social relationships, such as anthropology, sociology, and psychology, as well as literary studies. While the family is not absent in historical scholarship, family history has, until recently, been considered popular, treated as being of somewhat lesser significance, and tending to be marginalized, along with the more private pursuits of genealogy and autobiography. In Holocaust studies, however, as Natalia Alexion and Hanna Kubatova remind us, the family has long been understood as a significant social unit that impacted upon and indeed conditioned the experience of persecution and murder. The earliest efforts at documenting the mounting persecution, such as the work of the chroniclers of the ghettos, recognized the importance of family. Family was a crucial factor for individuals making decisions about how to respond to the ever greater limitations placed on Jewish life in Europe, particularly with the beginning of war in September 1939. Torn between responsibilities to parents, siblings, spouses, and children, Jews negotiated opportunities, including to flee, to join various resistance groups, or to go into hiding. While never absent in Holocaust research, a recent renewed focus on family brings scholarly attention to this key dimension of a person's lived experience and its cultural meaning in negotiating and becoming a refugee. Families torn apart and reconstituted by persecution and flight from Nazi Germany and by the vagaries of immigration policies often remained connected by correspondence, however disrupted by war, often by multiple dislocations and by deportation. What survives of such letters is not only a precious inheritance for subsequent generations. These letters are also increasingly valued by scholars as a significant historical source. In the last decade, research on so-called personal documents of the Holocaust has begun to proliferate, drawing on letters, diaries, and memoirs to excavate experiences of flight, survival, and death. This is to do with several important reorientations or turns in Holocaust studies, particularly those associated with seeking to gain a better understanding of the diversity of experiences of persecution and flight. It also has something to do with the passing into history of the generation of eyewitnesses, and following this, with their children and grandchildren often being drawn to investigate their families' pasts. Increasingly, letters and other items of huge personal and emotional significance to families of Holocaust victims also find their way into archives and are becoming accessible to researchers. The labor of maintaining family relationships is often invisible in daily life. When asked to verbalize it or to observe it in an anthropological or psychological studies, the presence of researchers and the creation of research data inserts a very visible, new, and impactful presence into the previously unobserved family relationships. Family correspondence, by contrast, shows developing and changing family relationships as they unfold, and it does so without a contemporaneous observer. Rather, the scholar who analyzes such letters has an effect on their interpretation in the present by working to reconstruct the contexts of their writing and reading and to account for their own interest in witnessing these written conversations. A long letter Ernst Oppenheim in Toronto addressed to his brother Hans in Kassel on the 24th of December 1938 allows us to explore perspectives, experiences, and shifting family relationships. Ernst opens with a copy of a letter the American consul in Stuttgart sent earlier in December to Senator Russell of Georgia. The consul's letter reveals that Hans and Trudy's waitlist number for the consulate to consider their immigration case is 12,041, and that this would only be processed from July 1940, clearly a very unsatisfactory timeframe. Ernst, who quotes this letter in full, takes the state of affairs as a starting point for giving Hans a piece of his mind about the, from his perspective, evident lack of progress in getting out of Germany. He somewhat dismisses the projected waiting time because even after the disastrous Evian conference on the refugee crisis, he hopes that Congress will wave through the immigration of 3 years' worth of quota refugees. However, he is very much at odds with what he sees as his brother's and his father's attitude towards emigration and with their, in his eyes, clearly deficient approach to American bureaucracy. This is a frank letter from one brother to another. In observance of family hierarchies and power dynamics, Ernst signals that he is aware of the schoolmasterly tone he adopts, and that it is somewhat unusual for the youngest sibling to speak in this manner. In justification, he points to his more immediate and longer experience of North American cultural and bureaucratic conventions, which account for his authority in the matter. While the formalities of a letter are observed, the conversational tone also suggests that the letter might have been conceived in a manner similar to a contribution to an intimate face-to-face conversation with his older brother, definitely out of their parents' earshot. Here is a flavor of Ernst's understanding of his family's tardiness in seeking emigration from Germany. The correspondence is in German and the translation is mine. I just cannot understand that you waited for such a long time until you decided to apply for a visa, so that it now takes ages until your number is up. Father's latest letter again seemed to me as if he is in no hurry to leave, because his GP practice is picking up business. This is something I had feared already before I began to arrange for his emigration. If father doesn't come now, I cannot and will not do anything else in this matter, and then you will need to see for yourselves how you will cope all on your own. Until now, it always was the case that Alice didn't want to leave before the parents, father not before the children. The child, Dorrit, was not supposed to grow up in a city in the US, but in the countryside. Then you are concerned about her education and so on. Now, father does not want to give up his practice before a certain date because the Jewish community, after 40 years, has finally recognized his value. Indeed, I asked you, before I put everything in motion, whether you are now willing to leave, and that means to leave under any condition or not. And you answered me, yes. Then I set all wheels in motion using the savings I had accumulated for a crucial business trip to Europe, thereby risking my own livelihood. Whether or not Ernst grasps the ways in which his father and siblings are constrained, both in how they approach their flight from Germany and in how they write about their efforts, is not immediately apparent. It is possible that even in December 1938, Ernst not only projected optimism to compel his brother to act more decisively, but that he was truly convinced that successful immigration to the United States was the most likely outcome for his brother and sister-in-law. It is certainly the case that Ernst's take on US immigration policy, American bureaucracy, and the implications of the letter from the consul in Stuttgart betray his distance from his brother's experiences in Germany, experiences that Ernst, in this and other letters, reduces to having been raised to display deference towards authority rather than to ask for what is one's rightful due. At this point, and for a while longer, Ernst displays an optimism that was likely already unwarranted at the time, but that was buoyed up by his recent trip to New York and to Washington, D.C. in pursuit of additional guarantors for his siblings' visa applications. Writing as he does, Ernst paints his brother's activities as ineffectual and resting on false information, as lacking in backbone and commitment. At the same time, Hans's activities are mindful of the numerous constraints on Jews seeking to leave Germany and of the real reluctance of the United States to permit any immigration. Thus, Ernst misinterprets German emigration and American immigration policies and practices as they pertain to Jews. Ernst writes, "You are letting your acquaintances tell you far too much nonsense instead of negotiating directly with the official and appointed authorities. It is completely understandable that the consulate responds to written inquiries only with printed forms, because it would be impossible for it to answer every letter in writing. And it is also American practice to write as little as possible. But I am confident that if you are referring to Senator Russell, Mr. Honecker, the US consul in Stuttgart, will most politely be available to meet with you, and he would certainly give you proper advice and tell you what can be done. It is not true that this, arriving without a visa, is not possible. Here again, you are misinformed, because people continue to arrive here and elsewhere who do not have an entry permit to here or elsewhere. You may not need a passport at all, but in any case, there are ways and means, and you just have to make an effort to find them out. The basic fact is that it is desirable for Jews to emigrate there. There is no doubt about that, and it can only be in the interest of the authorities to make it easier for you to leave the country. You just have to be assertive and know what you want, with all politeness and objectivity in such negotiations." It is not clear whether Ernst unwittingly or deliberately or naively misinterpreted the situation his family members found themselves in, and we do not know what Hans made of his brother's interpretation of his and his parents' situation in Germany. His reply to this letter has not survived. However, for our purposes, the discrepancy in the reality inhabited by Hans and that imagined by Ernst is striking. While Ernst is not wrong in saying that Germany wanted to get rid of its Jews, the ability to leave was constrained by laws that from 1938 stripped Jews of all their assets before being permitted to leave Germany, while visa regulations for the UK and the US sought to deter immigration. Those like Hans, not wealthy to begin with, needed guarantors in the US to provide assurances or affidavits that they would not become public charges. By 1938-39, Jews who did not bring sufficient funds and could not rely on sufficiently wealthy, close relatives stood virtually no chance legally to immigrate to the US. All Hans and Trudy could muster was the admittedly very wealthy Mr. Sam Adler of Savannah, Georgia, whose wife was a childhood friend of Trudy's. Trudy's cousin, Kitty Bear, although being a family member and reasonably well established in New York, and therefore on paper their best chance for an affidavit that could convince US immigration authorities, was unsuccessful in her efforts. Ernst, and from 1940 onwards, Alice's affidavits were deemed insufficient due to their own precarious financial situation and Ernst not being a resident in the United States. And yet, further on in the letter, Ernst goes as far to suggest that Consul Honecker had already made an in-principle decision that indicated the likely success of Hans and his family's immigration to the US. What is going on here, and why does it matter? It would be easy to dismiss this letter and others in this correspondence as of marginal interest due to their idiosyncratic nature and the focus on a specific family. But that would miss the point. Drawing on David Gerber's work on immigrant letters, Shirley Gilbert contends that refugee correspondence can give access to the details of the process of immigration and its effect on Jewish family relationships. Ernst's letter offers much insight into his and his wider family's communication strategy at a time of extreme stress. This is an emotional piece of writing that urgently communicates his anxieties and wishes to his older brother. We cannot reconstruct the brothers' relationship before the exchanges took place entirely by letter, but this letter suggests a deep connection and a trusting confidence of being understood. We can also understand more about Ernst's perception of Nazi Germany and the social and legal context in which Hans had to operate. Ernst's interpretation of what is going on in Kassel rests on what his family is telling him, in addition to newspapers and personal connections with refugees in Toronto, New York, and Washington, D.C., and with agencies working with Jewish refugees. His letter betrays his lack of comprehension of the reality of Jewish life in Germany and the real constraints to emigration that could not have been overcome by letting go of trust in the power of the law and of deference to authorities. This letter offers a deeper understanding of the layers of emotional communication within the Oppenheim family, and it provides insight into particular structures of interpersonal communication when a family is torn apart and the letter would permanently substitute for what was previously entirely conversation-based communication. Ernst translates what he might say face-to-face onto the page in an effort to maintain the intimacy of the previous in-person relationship. Ernst takes advantage of the familiar or intimate in a way that would otherwise be high-handed. It shows that such family intimacy translates into a specific kind of social capital. Observing such intimacy attributes meaning and weight to familiar communication. In a related context, Nikki Hallett focuses on the complexities of communication in private letters that affect writers and readers. Analogous to face-to-face communication, letters rely on mutual understanding between participants in an exchange. However, the participants' involvement in the exchange is never direct and simple, is never a direct and simple presentation of oneself to another, but always subject to a process of representation that can reveal as much as it can conceal. Writers and readers have multiple purposes in writing and reading, and part of what scholars as unintended and much later recipients engage in is a process of decoding, shifting messages and purposes contained in the form, text, and materiality of letters. Ernst's letter reveals the strength of his relationship with his older brother, a solidity that allows him freely to share his frustration with his family's seeming reluctance to leave Germany. His emotional and emotive letter centers on his own life world and experience, which has developed over a number of years in a context very different from that inhabited by Hans. Ernst's intimate relationship with Hans permits him to challenge sibling hierarchy and at the same time reveals his own unfamiliarity with the reality of Hans's life in Kassel. However fragmentary and idiosyncratic, refugee family correspondence archives are compelling sources that allow us to contemplate a range of different perspectives to build an understanding of what family means and of how each member positioned themselves within and towards that whole. In this perspective, the displaced and dispersed Oppenheim family emerges as a discursive community that is at once constituted and transformed through their correspondence during the process of flight and settlement. At the same time, the correspondence reflects their changing social identities, the impact of experiences, and the changing roles of family members. Focusing on one family can open up a larger thematic historical context by regarding the specific family's experiences as an access point. Thereby, the family becomes the funnel through which themes such as preparation to flee, passage to places of refuge, arrival, settlement, language acquisition, friendships, professional development, memory, and so on are opened up for closer examination. Questions of gender, class, profession, and age, among others, play a key role in understanding both the specifics of an individual's and a family's experiences and the broader social and cultural consciousness that conditioned these. Here, individual lives are not an illustrative addition to a broader narrative. Rather, the specific individuals and their experiences become an access point, shaping our perspective on the wider circumstances in which their lives unfolded. Those alive then shared mentalities, education, and worldviews with others, and these were all reflected in their lives wherever they were placed in society. A focus on the family as a site of meaning-making points not only to the heart of the concerns of cultural history, it also turns deliberately to the concerns of the first generation of Jews who wrote about the Holocaust. Amos Goldberg, who I quoted earlier, provides this helpful summary of the approaches taken by Jewish writers who experienced the Holocaust, members of the intelligentsia, most of whom had an academic education, and some of whom were professional academics in Eastern, Central, and Western Europe, and who wrote during the war era, or during the first years after the war. These texts are chiefly concerned with issues of consciousness and culture. In them, the writers turn, each coming from his or her own political, spiritual, academic, and intellectual orientation, to the examination of the social, psychological, and cultural existence of Jews under Nazi rule. These writers produced the very first analytic and reflective texts about Jews in the Holocaust era. Family archives can thus be access points to the networks that provide social meaning and support. The Oppenheim Family Archive evidences the absence of a network that extends beyond the nuclear family and the local Jewish community, and points to an increasingly insular existence of this family as the racialization of German society intensified. And yet, the connection between individuals, social groups, class, and politics can be observed in the family's struggle to negotiate the impact of political change and social and economic survival. The Oppenheim Archive thus provides an opportunity to explore the impact of the transformation of German society on the meaning of family in the context of displacement and dispersal. I often return to Hilary Mantel's Wreath Lectures of 2017, in which she spoke beautifully about her work as a historical novelist, the distinction between the work of the historian and of the novelist, and what the two professions have in common. First and foremost, Mantel reminds us of the distance between ourselves and the people of the past, and the humility with which we need to approach our pursuit of history. She writes, "The pursuit of the past makes you aware, whether you are a novelist or historian, of the dangers of your own fallibility and inbuilt bias. The writer of history is a walking anachronism, a displaced person, using today's techniques to try to know things about yesterday that yesterday didn't know itself. He or she must try to work authentically, hearing the words of the past, but communicating in a language the present understands." The topics I've worked on, as you have heard, have been varied, and yet a thread running throughout my scholarship is my interest in the experience of history of those whose lives were transformed by the Holocaust, alongside questions of representation and of how we know what we know. Hilary Mantel's characterization of historians and novelists as displaced persons who dig up the past in ways the inhabitants of the time couldn't do themselves is apt. What we know and how we know things about the past differs vastly from those who were alive then. Historians and novelists alike need to act as translators from one time into another, from the languages of the past into the languages of the present, depending on context, genre, and audience. The interest is in seeing how people did their lives and lived their experiences and perspectives. We often know how events happened and what happened, but we only are beginning to talk about how these things were made sense of by those who experienced and lived the past. Eavesdropping on other people's conversations permits us a glimpse into the ways in which individuals and families interpreted and thought about their lives. the practices of such listening in can also be a guide to how we encounter other, unfamiliar people, a small part of whose lives we see only through a sideways glance from the corner of our eyes when they are on the move. And thank you for listening.